Hello economics students, in this video we're looking at the dot point, the methods of financing a deficit or utilising a surplus. And really what this video and this dot point is all about is if the government runs a deficit for a financial year, e.g. their expenses are greater than their revenues, they have a negative outcome, how do they finance that deficit? How do they get the money? And if they run a surplus, e.g. their revenues are greater than their expenses, so they have some money left over, maybe call it 5 billion. What do they do with that money? Let's get into it. Now, financing is a key word when we're thinking about the deficit because there's only one way that a government can spend money that they don't have, and that is to finance or to borrow money. So the trick you want to, or the thing you want to avoid doing is thinking, oh, the government could just go back and increase its revenues, increase taxes, or sell some assets. Or they could just go back and stop spending as much money, and that way they would finance the deficit. No, that would be changing the composition of the budget, and what we're really looking at is how would they finance, how would they borrow. There's actually only one way that the government can borrow, and that's by selling bonds, and we'll look at that in the next video. So the reason they can't go back is that revenues have already been received, and outlays have already been spent, so there's really only one way, and that's to borrow. So let's get into it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about bonds because I think bonds are really interesting. The only way the government can borrow money is, well, the only way they do borrow money is by selling bonds or by selling securities. Sometimes they're called treasury notes, but they're basically all the same thing. A bond is an IOU. It's a piece of paper that literally, well, not literally, but it basically means, in very fancy legal terms, IOU. And the word comes from, it's quite an old word, it's a bond because it joins two parties together. It joins a seller and a buyer, basically a lender and a borrower. The government is always the borrower in this situation because they need to finance their deficit. And the way that they do that is they sell bonds to financial markets. Okay, here's a look at an old bond. Bonds have been around for a very long time. This is a bond from 1987. It's issued by the Commonwealth Government of Australia. They probably ran a budget deficit that year. And some key things to look at here is that the bond has a face value or a value. This is $20. It has an interest rate or a coupon rate, which is 5.25%. And it has a date that you have to pay the bond back, which is the 15th of November, 1987. So what do all these things mean? Well, if the government needed to borrow $5 billion, they would sell the amount of bonds, I can't do the maths here, but they would sell whatever the amount of bonds they needed to sell at $20 to get $5 billion. The investor in the bond will do this, they'll lend money to the government because they receive a return, this thing here called the coupon rate or the interest rate. And a bit of bond history down here, old bonds used to have these little things that you tear off to say, hey government, you owe me this coupon payment, you owe me this coupon payment, and you owe me this coupon payment. Of course, bonds are not done physically anymore. They're all done electronically, and you can buy and sell them online. So the investor in the bond receives interest along the way, and they also receive their money back at the end of the period, or what's called the maturity date. So this is how the government finances their deficit. They sell any number of these into the financial markets. So who do they sell them to? And this is part of the study design. There's really two main options for them. They sell them to local investors. Like I said, they can actually sell them not directly, but indirectly to you or me. They could sell them to big investment funds or investment banks or superannuation funds, those sorts of things, insurance companies. Or they could sell them to the same sort of people, but overseas. The only difference is if you sell them overseas, it increases your net foreign debt, and obviously leads to debits on net primary incomes if we think back to our old outcome. They sometimes, technically they could sell bonds to the RBA. They don't usually do this directly. It's quite rare. There is a government department that manages all of this stuff, basically in charge of making sure the government has enough money to pay its expenditure, and their job is to sell enough bonds to meet the financial needs of the government. It's probably a good point to say that the government doesn't just go out at the end of the budget period and sell $5 billion worth of bonds to meet a $5 billion deficit. They'll sell them as they need, and that's why we have a whole government department dedicated to this. All right, so what do they do if they have a surplus? What do they do if they've got some money left over? And I think here it helps to just think about your own personal situation. if you had some money left over after a week, if you've got $100 left over after your expenses and your revenues, what are you going to do with it? You're either going to pay off any existing debts that you have, you might invest it into the stock market or into maybe some bonds, or you're going to save it in a bank account. It's exactly the same three for the government. If they have a surplus, if they have money left over, they have those three choices. The first thing they're going to do is pay off their debt, and again, it's the Australian Office of Financial Management that would manage this for them, because as bonds mature, they need to be paid back. So if you were the holder of one of those bonds in that last little slide here, on November 1987, you were owed your $20 back, as were all bondholders. So the government could pay back at maturity a bunch of its bonds, which would decrease its debt. You probably don't need to get into too much detail. All you need to know is if they have a surplus, they can pay down their debt. It's just that they do this via bonds. If they wanted to invest, they could invest into a couple of different funds. A big one is called the Future Fund, which was set up by the government. In the early 2000s, the governments ran lots of budget surpluses, and they were like, what do we do with all this money? We've paid down most of our debt. What do we do with it? Well, like you would probably do, they start to invest it. They put it in a big fund. It's called a sovereign wealth fund. Lots of countries have these. In Australia, it's called the Future Fund, and it's now worth about $250 billion. So the idea is that they invested to get a return on that investment. They invested in shares and private companies and infrastructure and property and bonds. And as the governments need that money, it's actually set aside for very specific spending. But as the governments might need that money in the future, they can draw down on that fund. All right, so in this video, we looked at what the government does if it has a deficit, or how it finances a deficit. Remember, they can't go back. And what do they do if they've got some surplus funds? All right, bye for now. Let me know if you've got any questions in the comments section.